And here we are with yet another Mrs. Shapiro video. Today we're talking about multiplying radicals. And it's a lot like multiplying with variables, so I think you'll see those similarities. Okay, so we've got 1 radical 3 times 1 radical 6. Again, remember they're hidden numbers there. So we'll multiply what's outside the radical first. 1 times 1 is 1. And then multiply what's inside the radical. 3 times 6, and that gives us an 18 inside a radical sign. And then we need to simplify that 18. So we can factor that to a radical 9 times a radical 2, right? Always putting the perfect square first. We could factor it with 6 and 3, but neither of those are perfect squares, so that doesn't really help us. So what we end up here is 1 times 3, right? The square root of 9 is 3. Radical 2, or 3 radical 2. Okay. Again, multiply here. 1 times 1 is 1. We don't necessarily have to write it. I just put it there to remind you that it's a 1. We multiply radical 12 times radical 2 times radical 12. We get radical 24. We always have to see if we can simplify that. Is there a perfect square that's a factor of 24? And the answer is yes. That's 4. So the square root of 4 times the square root of 6 is the square root of 24. We can simplify the square root of 4 as a 2. Again, when we find the square root, it comes out of the square root sign. Okay. Let's look at this. Again, I wrote the 1 just so you know. We multiply what's outside first, multiply what's inside to get radical 12, and then see if we can simplify the square root of 12. And we can. That's a square root of 4 times a square root of 3. You know, a lot of these numbers are coming up often, so hopefully you're remembering that square root of 12 is 4 times 3. Square root of 4 is 2. It's outside the radical sign. Square root of 3 we can't do. We multiply everything that's outside the radical, and then whatever's inside. Okay? Multiply what's outside. So we get negative 4, multiply what's inside. Or, if you notice this is a perfect square, what's the square root of 4? You're right, 2. So this problem becomes negative 4 radical 5 times 2. And we could multiply these two to get a negative 8. They're both outside the radical sign. And inside the radical sign, we still have a 5. But if you didn't notice that, let's work our way down here. We had negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. 5 times 4 in the radical sign is 20. And then we would factor it here. We'd rename the radical 20 as radical 4, radical 5. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 5 we can't do. Multiply these guys that are out, and we get negative 8. Oops, I do that all the time. Radical 5, same answer. Either way we do it. So if you notice that's a perfect square, you could simplify that first. All right, these are going to look more complicated. And they're not, they're just more steps. So here's what we're doing. We're multiplying this whole thing, negative 3 radical 3, times this whole thing. And then we're distributing. So we're doing this times here and times here, just like we would do with variables. So I'm going to cover this up so that I'm looking for something to cover this up with. I'm using my finger, I guess. All right. Let's look at it this way. We're multiplying these two parts. So negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. Radical 3 times radical 2 is radical 6. Okay. And then we're going to multiply negative 3 radical 3 times radical 5. So negative 3 times positive 1 is negative 3. Radical 3 times radical 5 is radical 15. And then we have to look at this to see if there's anything we can simplify. Can we factor 6 using a perfect square? No. We can do 2 and 3, but they're not a perfect square. And 15, same thing. 5 times 3, but neither of one is a perfect square. So this would just be our answer. We can't add these together because they don't have the same radical. Just like we can't add variables that aren't the same. This would be like if we had a 9a minus 3b, we wouldn't be able to add them because the variable's not the same. We can't add these because the radicals aren't the same. All right, let's distribute again here. So we're doing this times this. So 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. Radical 6 times radical 2, radical 12. Now we're doing 1 times this. So 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. Radical 6 times radical 3 is radical 18. Okay. We can't add them. They're not the same radical, but we also always have to look to make sure we have these in simple form, and they're not. We can factor 12 and simplify the square root of 12 by saying that's a radical 4 and a radical 3. And 18 has a perfect square factor of 9 times 2. So what we have here is negative 2. This becomes a 2. So negative 2 times 2, radical 3, minus 3. Square root of 9 is 3 outside the radical sign. Multiply what's outside. Multiply what's outside. The radicals are not the same, so we can't combine like terms. That's our answer. Okay. All right, same thing here. These actually are a little more simple. So we're still distributing. We're doing this times this and this times this. So first let's do this. 1 times 5, because 5's not in a radical sign. And radical 2 times no other radicals is just radical 2. 1 times 1 is 1. Radical 2 times radical 5, radical 10. We can't simplify either of these radicals, so we're done with that. We can't add them because they're not the same, so that's our answer. Okay, same thing here. 1 times 3 is 3. Radical 5 times radical 10, radical 50. 1 times 2, right, because these are both outside a radical sign, is 2, and radical 5 times no other radicals is just radical 5. We can't add these, they're not alike, but we can factor radical 50. We can factor that to the perfect square of 25 times 2. So this would give us 3 times 5 radical 2, or 15 radical 2. And over here we have 2 radical 5. Radicals aren't the same, we can't add them, and we've simplified both those radicals. Okay. All righty. Sometimes we have variables with these. So let's look at how that happens. We're going to multiply what's outside. So there's a hidden 1 here. Negative 3 times 1, negative 3. So this isn't distributed like the previous one. These are just straight up multiplication. And when we multiply everything in the radical sign, we get 15 times 8, which is 40. I have to think about that. What's 15 times 8? 0, 4, 120. Okay. 120, and we multiply the x's, x to the third. So now this looks like some problems you did a couple days ago, the end of last week. We need to simplify what's in this radical. So can we factor square root of 20? Well, we know 4 goes into that, so 4 is a factor. That would be 4 times 30. Use a calculator if you need help with that. And then the x to the third is x squared, and x to the first. And now let's simplify whatever we can. We have a negative 3. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 30 we can't do. Notice I'm going to leave a little space here. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of x to the first power we can't do. So it stays inside the radical sign. Okay, so we have negative 6x outside and 30x inside. On the variable, we could have used a shortcut I showed you, where this is a 2, and 2 goes into 3 one time, so that's outside, with 1 left over inside. If that makes sense, you can do that. All right, let's multiply here. We multiply everything in the radical sign. We get 50v to the third. We need to see if we can simplify any of that. 50 we can factor to 25 times 2, right? Radical 25 times radical 2 is radical 50. And let's try this one this way. Let's leave v to the third. So this is a 5, no radical sign. This is a 2, can't simplify it. And if we use that little shortcut, 2 goes into 3 one time, so that's outside, and there's 1 left over, so there's a first power left inside. Okay, and if we multiply things that are outside, we get 5x, multiply what's inside, we get radical 2x. Okay? I mean, I feel like these are pretty straightforward. I'm going to do this one because I feel like people miss this particular factor. So, 2 ways we could do this, and I'm going to show you both ways. You could notice that 9 is a perfect square. So the square root of 9 is 3. So that would come out. So that would make the problem this. All right? And then we would have 6m squared. So when we multiply what's in the radical, we get 6m to the third. 6 we can't do anything with. Maybe I'll split this into 2 parts just so it's more obvious. Okay, can't do anything with the square root of 6. M to the third, if we use our shortcut, we'd say 2 goes into 3 one time with 1 left over. So now this is what we have. What's outside gets multiplied. What's inside gets multiplied. Okay. All right, hold on. These look complicated. It's just the distributive property. Call it FOIL if you want. Okay, so we're going to multiply this times each of these, and then this times each of these, just like we do with FOIL. So radical 2 times radical 2, radical 4. Radical 2 times 5 is 5 radical 2. Now we're going to multiply by 4. 4 times radical 2 is 4 radical 2, right? This doesn't have a radical sign, so it stays outside. Radical 2 stays inside. And then 4 times 5. Both outside the radical sign, so that's 20. And then we need to look. There's like terms here. We can add them together. Square root of 4 we can simplify. The square root of 4 is 2. We've got these guys to add together. We have 5 radical 2 and 4 radical 2, which is 9 radical 2, and we have 20. And we can add these like terms together. So we get 22 plus 9 radical 2. Okay? Seems like a lot of steps, but it's just like multiplying with variables. Okay? Do this first. Radical 5 times radical 4, radical 20. Radical 5 times radical 2, radical 10. Now we're multiplying by this. Radical 2 times radical 4, radical 8. radical 2 times radical 2, radical 4. We can simplify this one easily. Square root of 4 is 2, so we can do that. We need to factor 20, square root of 20, to radical 4 times radical 5. So that gives us a 2 radical 5. Square root of 10, we can't do anything with. Square root of 8, you probably remember we can factor that. Square root of 4 times square root of 2. So the square root of 4 is 2. And we still have a radical 2. And then we look to see, here's our 4 terms. Do any of them have the same radical? No. So we can't combine them. We have integers, so we can combine the 10 and the 2 to get 12. And then we would have a 2 radical 5 and a 2 radical 2. We can't combine these. They don't have the same radical. You may need to watch this video twice on that one. Okay, stop it, rewind it, make sure you understand what's happening there. We'll do another one just like it. 1 times 2, so we're multiplying here. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times radical 2 is just 1 radical 2. Now we're multiplying by this. Radical 2 times 2 is just positive 2 radical 2. Radical 2 times radical 2, it's positive times positive, so it's positive radical 4. What can we simplify? Well, we've got like terms here. Oh, and we have a perfect square here, so let's do that. These are both radical 2, so we have a positive 1 and a positive 2. That's a positive 3 radical 2. Square root of 4 is 2, no radical sign. We've got integers, so we can combine them. And that's what we get. Okay. Last one looks a little different, but what it means is this times this again. So it means radical 3 minus 3 times radical 3 minus 3. Best to write it out. Multiply first. Radical 3 times radical 3, radical 9. Radical 3 times negative 3 is just negative 3 radical 3. Right? This is outside, this is inside, so we have to write them separately. Multiply by negative 3. Negative 3 times radical 3, negative 3 radical 3. And negative 3 times negative 3, positive 9. Right? Negative times negative is positive. We can simplify the square root of 9, that's 3. These both have radical 3, so we have a negative radical 3 and a negative radical 3. It's a negative 6 radical 3. We have a 9 at the end here. And then these are both integers, we can combine them. Okay. Again, rewatch the video. I've done them each the exact same way. The challenge is it's not always, things don't always happen in the same order. Here we had a radical we could simplify, and these were the same. Here, these middle terms weren't the same, but we had a radical, but we could combine these integers to get 12, and then we just have the radical 5 and the radical 2. You can tell from looking at this, you need to be neat, and you need to follow, be methodical, go step by step. In the end, you need to make sure you've combined like terms, whether it's integers or whether it's radicals, and that you've simplified everything you can that's inside a radical sign. Okay? Square root of 4, square root of 9. All right? If you need help, email me. We'll set up a time to meet. Take care.